Today's question on the Geopolitics Helpline is a follow-up to our discussion from a few days ago about Russia's ability to invade Europe. For further context, the main point of that video was that domestic political constraints dictate Russia's current war strategy in Ukraine. The war is unpopular in Russia, and thus the Kremlin has to use voluntary contracts to recruit soldiers. Mass conscription would result in protests on the streets, which Putin wants to avoid. In turn, despite Russia's lackluster progress in Ukraine, Moscow still poses a threat to the rest of Europe, if public opinion in Russia would support that fight. That takes us to today's question. With so much of the old Soviet stockpile getting used up in Ukraine, how effective would conscription be? Getting 1 million men together is one thing, but what about arming them? For context, a ton of outdated Soviet weapons had been sitting in Russian warehouses for decades prior to the war. Gerasimov and company found interesting ways to adapt what was available. There are legacy tanks with all sorts of modifications to handle drones, for example. But the most notable innovation was to fashion airfoils onto old explosives. These garbled pieces of tech became the glide bombs that have relentlessly struck Ukrainian infrastructure for years now. Getting back to the question, the answer is that Russian conscripts would be a danger, even without warehouses of Soviet equipment, though the reasons why are complicated. Let's walk through the three main issues. 1. The utility of those stockpiles against the West. 2. Russia's post-war production. And 3. The production gap in the West. As a starting point, it is unclear how much value the Soviet stockpiles could have provided in a war against Europe. Clearly, they have provided a ton of value against Ukraine. But the problem with extrapolating the Ukrainian experience further west is that Ukraine was a poor country before the war, and its domestic institutions were a mess. It could not afford much of the latest military tech. Those aforementioned glide bombs only work because Ukraine lacks the ability to shoot down Russian jets deep across the border. Well, we have seen in Iran what top-of-the-line weapons can do against enemy air defenses, which in turn allows an air force to operate unimpeded in enemy territory. Russia would not be as simple to shut down as Iran was, but there are a lot of people in Belgium betting that Russia would not want to experiment with flying fighters anywhere near NATO territory quickly enough after hostilities begin. Other legacy platforms like Soviet tanks might also run into problems as Europe cuts off their supply lines. Europe would not be invincible, of course. The United States lost a fighter over the skies of a deeply depleted Iran, and Russia would be a tougher fight. But one would imagine Europe would be willing to risk further casualties to dominate the supply lines, given the high-stakes nature of this hypothetical situation. So, in summary, Russian successes here are a function of Ukraine's situation, and would not extend to the rest of Europe. Obviously, the Kremlin would still prefer having larger legacy stockpiles to smaller legacy stockpiles. It is just that the difference there is marginal. From a Doctrine perspective, what should give Europe some pause is how we cannot be sure what will happen when Russia matches its new drone-centric war plan against a more traditional NATO approach. Note that I am not making this into a call of defeatism, that the West has no idea what it is doing in an era of cheap one-way systems. There is a reason that the West still has faith in exquisite systems that will shut off those aforementioned Russian supply lines, eventually starving out those drone operators who would otherwise clog up the front line. I also think that a lot of the defeatism that you will hear online about the results in Iran is plainly misguided. It should not be hard to realize that it can be simultaneously true that you can bomb the ever-loving heck out of a country, but that achieving very difficult war goals, like driving the opposing regime out of power without boots on the ground, may not be easy despite all of those bombs. And it is not like Europe is ignoring the problem. In fact, we have spent ample time discussing what NATO's Allied Command transformation is developing to address the challenge. Heck, I have personally spent many hours talking to the folks directly working on those projects. I have faith that they will work. Nonetheless, Faith is not the same as certainty, and that presupposes anyone in Europe adopts those solutions. More on that in a minute. In turn, I would be worried that Europe's assessment here is still wrong, leaving a vulnerability that Russia one day may try to exploit. And we can all laugh in the West that Russia has been reduced to a third-rate power that needs to resort to drones to do anything relevant. But I do not believe that these Western laughs would continue once Russian troops arrive in Tallinn. And my apologies once again to the lovely people of Estonia for picking on you. The second main point is what will happen with Russian stockpiles once the war in Ukraine comes to a close. This was one of my recurring comments before we all got distracted by the Iran war. But there is a fundamental misunderstanding among the general public regarding what the Russian economy will look like once the war ends. The common expectation is that the country will collapse because everything is an absolute mess. Moreover, the invasion continues because war spending is the only thing keeping the economy afloat. Well, if you will let my academic alter ego offer his logical assessment of the situation, that argument is absolutely absurd. If spending can keep the Russian economy from crashing, then any spending will do. It need not be war spending. Further, if you are doing that spending outside of a war, you actually get to keep what you produce. There is no doubt that the Russian economy is running too hot, and slamming on the brakes will just lead to an economic crash. Rather, the competent to a fault central bank will prefer a slow deceleration. That means a lot of excess government spending will continue post-war. Most of that will be geared toward addressing infrastructure issues that will have suffered from a half-decade of neglect. The thing is, though, Russia has built a lot of new infrastructure during the war. It has just been factories that can produce those new weapons of war, the ones that Europe cannot be sure that it is ready to handle. The fixed cost of weapons production tend to be the most brutal. But once you have everything paid for, it is much easier to keep the lights on and the assembly lines moving. Personally, if I worked at the Russian Ministry of Defense, I would gladly trade my antiquated Soviet stockpiles for all of the infrastructure that I need to mass-produce one-way weapon systems. As a final point, there is a significant production gap between Russia and the West regarding these technologies. If reliance on exquisite weapon systems is misguided, then Russia will begin shifting the line of control further west, and there will be a time gap between then and when Europe course corrects. Obviously, NATO countries are not oblivious to the potential need for one-way systems. That is, again, an area of development that I have first-hand knowledge of, and perhaps first-hand responsibility for setting back. Sorry, team. And you might think to yourself that maybe Ukraine can fill in the gaps here. Kyiv has also been running a war for the last 4+ years, so it too has the infrastructure to mass-produce drones. The problem there is that Ukraine is in a much worse economic shape than Russia is, all due to how the war mostly takes place on Ukrainian soil. In turn, there will be much greater focus on rebuilding rather than continued arming in the post-war world. The obvious resolution to this problem is that a willing buyer steps in to keep the Ukrainian factories running and exporting the one-way systems to partner countries. But that solution presupposes that Europe takes the problem seriously and spends accordingly. Now, will Europe take its defense spending seriously? Well, 28 of them have pledged to do so. Canada is excluded for not being in Europe. Iceland is excluded because it does not have a military. Spain is excluded because reasons. However, European countries have made a similar pledge before and failed to follow through. So it is time to take bets on whether this round will be any different. Even if the euros are flowing, there is always a certain level of nativism when it comes to military spending. Sentiments like, they are our euros, so we should only be spending them in European territories. Sorry, Ukraine, but you are out of luck. Plus, there is the more legitimate strategic point that continuing to build out military production in a frontline country is not as secure as having it in a place like, say, Portugal. None of these points are backbreaking, of course. It is just that there is no guarantee that Europe will fill in the gaps. Meanwhile, you can fill in the gaps on your bookshelf by picking up one of these two wonderful books about the war. It has been a while since we've seen these beauties, hasn't it? Check the video description for more information on them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.